Well, welcome to the Friday Bubble. Today we're at the launch of Grand Siécle, iteration number 24. Now, I'm pointing at it and holding it because it's a Magnum, and I always think they need a little bit more pizzazz. And we have Laurent-Perrier 2007 here, and we'll tell you how that all links. Now, to join me in helping to describe this wonderful story of Grand Siécle are two of the Grand Siécle brand ambassadors. Edouard, if you haven't met, and David Hesketh, Master of Wine. Now, who's doing what today? Because we have some fabulous things to share with everybody. Tell us why we have 2007 here, Edouard.
It may sound a little bit weird to have a vintage prior to Grand Siécle, but for us, it's the perfect introduction, since this is the majority vintage that's going to be in composition of the blend we're going to have together. Different wines for sure, but the majority is 2007, then completed for the 24 by 2006 vintage and 2004. So we thought it would be a good introduction to have just a single expression of the vintage first, and then compare it to what the expression of the perfect year would be through the 24th iteration with the majority of the 7.
Brilliant. Well, while you tell us a little bit about Grand Siécle,
Sure.
I'm going to
Open these big bottles?
do the fun bit.
Sure. So Grand Siécle came as an idea during a time where most of the prestige cuvées were actually being released in Champagne, and took the same direction, the direction of a single vintage expression. And when Bernard de Donancourt understood that he had to have a prestige cuvée to forge the reputation of the house, he observed this frequency and the expression of all these vintages that were coming, and he thought that rather than doing the same as the others, he could also be different and create its own ID, loyal to the Champagne DNA, which is the blend, and actually blending together complementary vintages, top vintages from Champagne, in order to create a result that a single vintage could not reach. And that's the definition of recreating the perfect year, is combining the aspects, the characteristics of these top vintages that are again complementary to each other in order to create a unique result. So he put it a frame on the paper in order to have as much as consistency as possible within the different blends that you would obtain, and the first one that it would always be 3 vintages blended together.
Right.
Declared vintages from the house, so not made every year, declared vintages from the house. The second frame is that we will take the grapes only from the top Grand Cru of Champagne, a selection of the top Grand Cru of Champagne. And so far, within the 17 Grand Cru we have in Champagne, only a maximum of 11 have been ever used, and we are actually going to have these 11 on this 24th blend. And finally, last but not least, it would be a minimum aging time on the lees that would allow the wines to reach the right harmony, the right balance, and also the right equilibrium between the 3 vintages, which is for the bottle about a minimum of 10 years on the lees, and for the magnums a few more years to reach because of this special environment.
And I think an important thing to understand is that actually the Laurent-Perrier, the vintage, is actually a great example, because you need wines with staying power. And I think this is, if there's a vintage tier that has staying power, it's actually these wines, isn't it? It's the regular vintage tier.
Yeah.
The key thing about vintage declaration at Laurent-Perrier is the usual questions: is the quality of fruit good enough? Does the year stand alone
Yes.
by comparison? They are taken for granted. The key reason for declaring a vintage at Laurent-Perrier is it will be one of the 3 vintages that will be in Grand Siécle. And the key thing there is that it's capable of long aging. And there are 2 phases of aging. One as a still wine, a Van Clair, as the 2 vintages wait for the 3rd component vintage, and then in the case of this Magnum, 14 years on its lees. So there's a long period of aging. So as a result, Laurent-Perrier since 1950 to 2015, our most recent vintage declaration, we've declared 31 vintages, whereas the region has declared 52. So we have an eye on a future iteration of Grand Siécle when the cellar master declares a vintage.
Right. And I think, just to be clear, it's always really, it can be a bit confusing. The reason we have this is because it's 55%.
50% Chardonnay.
50% of what we're tasting. So we were going to have a look at the vintage characteristics. This bottle is shining. It's got Magnum effect in buckets. And I think it's going through this beautiful phase. You know when you get young fruit, expressive citrus, and now this is going to the dried, candied fruit.
And I think Edouard was describing the vision around Grand Siécle, and in Bernard's mind, what he wanted was to produce a wine that was capable of long lees aging, and yet over that period of maturity, it took on some secondary flavours and aromas as well, and yet kept a vibrancy and a freshness. And if you think of a single vintage, they have a linear evolution where they're young, middle-aged, and then mature. But by blending three complementary vintages together, you get elements of all three within the same wine.
Brilliant.
At the same time.
At the same time.
Have you tasted the 2007?
Yes, I'm always amazed by the freshness of the wines, and this is exactly as you described. Our style is very much into freshness and elegance, and I think this choice of going for the stainless steel tanks back in 1973, so the first house in Champagne, to fully integrate and move the production from concrete to stainless steel tanks has definitely served that style and this desire to go even beyond into freshness and preservation of the vibrancy and the fruitiness of the wines. And this is a great example because Magnum is obviously has also its own environment and preserve best the freshness from the wines.
And I think it's important to kind of reference the 7 vintage. We had a run of really good ones, 2, 4, to some extent 6. 7 was a little overshadowed. It was quite wet and cool in the summer. But actually what that does mean is the vineyards that were in the great locations, they have this vibrancy and they have this energy, and actually very pure. So there's nothing in here we don't want. Meunier had a very tough time in 07. There's no Meunier here, of course, so we're not worrying about that. Just Chardonnay, and it's the yellow fruit that I think gives me that little, it's fighting, isn't it? It's got that energy and toast.
Which was coming mostly from the Pinot Noir side, when what we saw was also the white fruit was coming from the Chardonnay side. I think what was stunning back in the days when it was tasted as vin clair is that the potential of aging of these wines. They were showing tremendous energy, and it was one of the decisions that actually led Laurent-Perrier to declare this year as a vintage, because of the quality of both grapes, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, from these Grand Cru villages selected over there, but also the potential of aging of these seal wines selected for the vintage.
Now, what's going to be fascinating is, can we recognise, when there's 50% of 2007 in here, can we pick up that vintage characteristic? Because I think that's the genius of blending, isn't it? You're taking some of the best of those, what we love in this year, and then adding 2 other great components to it. So, what are you seeing there, David? You've had a sneaky preview.
Even in the light in this room, you can see there's a difference in colour.
Oh yes, that's fascinating.
The Grand Siécle iteration 24 is lighter, and I find at Laurent-Perrier, citrus is the hallmark of the acidity, and for me in the 2007, it's a rich grapefruit style acidity that pulls it right back on the finish. Whereas in the Grand Siécle, it's more lime. There's a little bit of reduction, and then underneath there's almost a lime cordial freshness, and then on the palate it's much fresher. Even counterintuitively, you've got 6 and 4 in there, not just 2007. And I think the point that Edouard was making about blending complementary vintages together, you get that freshness that you would not get just in 2007.
And I think you really see this because 06, quite a solar year, and so there was a lot of ripeness. And I think that's where some of that, there's a little bit of roasty, toasty pineapple in there. That's true. And I think that's really, but the one thing I love in this, which I don't always get in young Grand Siécle, is this bitter orange in the palate. And it's just like so.
It's almost like orange pith, isn't it?
It is.
That zest that you get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I found always amazing about when tasting Grand Siécle as a Magnum is always the density that the wine gets in regards to the comparison with the bottle, and that's to me one of the expression of the Magnum effect, and why I think it's definitely a format that deserves to be aged for a longer time, because of that volume that suddenly the wine gets with this extensive aging time on the lees. And I think this 60% to 2007, we can feel the style of that majority vintage, but we get also what is all the add-ons coming from the vintage 06, as you mentioned, is much more solar as a year.
Yes.
And also 04, which was very much a sharp and linear vintage.
Nick, I think you've been very fair comparing a Magnum and a Magnum, because then you have the similar Magnum effect.
Exactly,
And I
yes.
think what you see in iteration 24 is that additional time on lees. There's a creaminess and a silkiness. There's a textural difference between the 2007.
Because we must be, what, 6 or 7 years between 24 in bottle
Yes.
and 24 in Magnum.
24 in bottle was released in May 2019 after
Right.
10 years on the lease, and the Magnums of 24 are being released now after 16 years on the lease. So
And they do feel like you've got such a rich mouthful of fruit.
yeah.
It just feels like it's about ready. So, delicious. And I think the more time it has, I like it goes, some of that like chocolatey elements come out with not, a little bit of time in the glass.
For me, your chocolate is perhaps my little coffee note.
Coffee note,
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a truffly note in a really nice way, really nice.
There is a savouriness.
Mm.
And I think what people often do not think about is putting a champagne like this with food. I think it is a true Van der Garde. They're aged, but they work well with food. They're a serious wine, not just a champagne.
And the big question, of course, is does Grand Siècle age?
Oh, I would say yes.
Definitely.
Now, it has an amazing ability. I think we're only just discovering it. We've had some occasions between us where we've tasted some old iterations, not always quite possible to tell which ones they are, but we know they're of a certain era, and they can be glorious, and they're like 30, 40 years old.
Yeah, I think if I have to structure this the answer to your question, I would say we have two possibilities of aging. I would say the first is the aging on lees. For sure, Grand Siècle has the capacity to age on the lees. We see it in the bottle. It is a minimum of 10 years, can go up to 12. For the Magnums, it's from 14 years, basically. That's the time we leave between the bottles and the Magnums as a difference. And it can goes up to even more, since we also have a third expression, which is called les réserves, that you also know very well.
Right.
Once the ones being actually disgorged, what we've been noticing, and it's true that you're probably the best, I would say, witness of the capacity of aging of Grand Siècle, but up to 30, 40 years, it is difficult to say if the wine is tired. I think it's not. It's always a wine that is shining. So it's still a question mark about what's the real potential of aging of Grand Siècle.
Right.
We are working on it, truly, but it will take another decade or more to deliver.
And of course, if some of these early releases can be tasting this great now, when the technology wasn't as great, then we can only just barely predict how some of these younger ones now, when the technology's got so much better, how they're going to have a journey.
And there was something in you said, Nick, that was kind of hidden in what you said about
Always.
not knowing what the iterations were.
Yes.
And we've had 26 now. 26 is available in bottle, 24 is available in Magnum. But this is the first iteration where you will be able to compare bottle and Magnum carrying an iteration number, because it was in April 2019 with the launch of 22 in Magnum and 24 in bottle that the consumer with certainty could know the component vintages and indeed the crus that are in there as well.
Right, well, gentlemen,
Merci, Nick.
I think
Merci, David.
that
Cheers.
was
Cheers.
a perfect story about Grand Siècle and iteration number 24 in a Magnum. We have got 2 bottles. Normally I would just have to have a little tease and say, which one are we taking to dinner? Because it could be considered extravagant to take them both.
I think
Or
if we have 2 courses, a bottle per
A
course.
bottle per course.
Exactly.
Thank you, gents.
Cheers. Thank you
Thank
again.
you,
Thank you
Edouard.
again. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Cheers.
And I hope you enjoyed our tasting. If you don't have any of these in your cellar, either of them actually, because we do have some of the vintage Magnums as well. But really, this one, drink it now and have enough. to drink over the next 20 years. Cheers.
Cheers.